September 1944. 14 weeks after Normandy, Allied forces reached the German frontier. On the map, it is 300 miles. On the ground, it is mud, burned-out vehicles, and towns reduced to ash. Ahead of them stands the Westwall, what the Allies call the Siegfried Line, a defensive belt stretching nearly 400 miles, tens of thousands of bunkers, minefields, barbed wire, concrete teeth built to stop tanks. It was never meant to win battles outright. It was built to buy time, long enough for German reserves to arrive and strike back. But the Allies reached this wall with something already running out: fuel, ammunition, and men. While they paused for logistics, the Germans patched the concrete with civilians and Hitler Youth, filling firing ports and steel doors just in time. And then there is one place where plans dissolve without explanation: the Hürtgen Forest. Dense trees, ravines, mines beneath wet leaves, artillery exploding in the treetops. American soldiers give it a name that carries no exaggeration: the Death Factory. This is not the story of a breakthrough. It is the story of how a defensive line turns time into a weapon, and every step forward into a price paid in blood. By the summer of 1944, Western Europe was no longer quiet. After the Normandy landings, the Western Front began to move at a speed neither side had fully anticipated. Allied formations advanced day after day, their maps changing faster than supply officers could update them. Armored columns pushed forward hundreds of miles, outrunning the logistical systems that were meant to sustain a modern, mechanized army. From the beaches of Normandy to the German frontier, distance was not the greatest challenge. What wore the Allies down was time, cumulative losses, and exhaustion. Hundreds of thousands of men had been killed or wounded during the liberation of France. Many frontline units were operating at half strength. Tanks were abandoned along the roads due to mechanical failure. Ammunition and fuel became resources to be rationed, measured day by day. In this context, an old name returned from near-forgotten military planning files: Siegfried Line. To the Germans, it was the Westwall. To the Allies, it was a defensive belt nearly 400 miles long, stretching from the Dutch border in the north to Switzerland in the south. It was not a new structure. It had been built in the late 1930s, before the war even began. For years, it existed more in propaganda films and diplomatic calculations than in operational reality. But by September 1944, the Westwall was no longer a political symbol. It had become the last barrier before German soil. Construction of the Westwall began in 1938, during a period when Nazi Germany sought to intimidate France and Britain rather than engage them directly. Its original purpose was psychological. The idea was simple: present Germany as a fortress of concrete and steel, strong enough to discourage attack. At that stage, the Westwall's diplomatic value far exceeded its military worth. After Germany's victory over France in 1940, the defensive line rapidly lost relevance. Its artillery pieces and machine guns were removed and transferred to the Atlantic Wall. Bunkers were left unmanned. Trenches deteriorated. For years, there was no serious effort to maintain or modernize the system. Even after the Allied landings in Normandy in June 1944, Berlin did not treat the Westwall as a priority. Hitler and the German High Command still believed the decisive battles would be fought in France. That belief collapsed in August 1944. Germany's defeat in Normandy was not a single catastrophic event. It was a sequence of failures that compounded one another. German formations were forced back step by step until large elements were encircled and destroyed in the Falaise pocket. Only a fraction of those forces escaped eastward. The survivors were exhausted, poorly equipped, and shaken. Yet they still possessed one crucial advantage: they were falling back toward their homeland. As these remnants approached the German frontier, the Westwall suddenly mattered again. It did not need to be perfect. It only needed to delay. For the Allies, the situation created a dangerous illusion. German troops appeared to be retreating in disorder. Paris had been liberated. Many senior commanders believed that sustained pressure could end the war before the end of 1944. It was a moment of optimism and a moment of misjudgment. Only in late August and early September 1944 did Hitler fully accept the possibility of an Allied invasion of Germany from the west. The Westwall was placed on emergency status. There was no time, there were limited materials, There were no large reserves. The regime mobilized approximately 360,000 civilians, along with thousands of boys from the Hitler Youth, to repair bunkers, lay mines, and rebuild anti-tank obstacles. In a matter of weeks, what had seemed like abandoned ruins were patched together into a functioning defensive system. The results were uneven. Some sectors remained weak, others became formidable strongpoints. But it was enough. The Westwall was not a continuous wall. It was a layered defensive zone, in some areas several kilometers deep. Within that zone were roughly 22,000 bunkers, shelters, and command posts. Interlocking fields of fire with positions supporting one another, extensive minefields, barbed wire obstacles, rows of concrete anti-tank pyramids known as Dragon's Teeth. Many bunkers featured reinforced concrete roofs over 2 meters thick and steel doors weighing several tons. These structures were not designed to repel a massive assault indefinitely. Their purpose was to hold attackers in place, inflict losses, and buy time for mobile reserves to counterattack. In modern warfare, time is a weapon. By early September 1944, the Allies faced a growing problem that had little to do with German resistance: logistics. Supply lines stretched back to the Normandy beaches. Rail networks were shattered. The port of Antwerp had been captured, but its approaches were still blocked. Fuel shortages became critical. A mechanized army can advance faster than its supply system. When that happens, speed becomes a liability rather than an advantage. At the same time, Allied forces lacked practical experience in assaulting heavy continuous fortifications on land. Training exercises provided limited guidance against reinforced bunkers, overlapping fire, and dense minefields. The terrain also changed. The open fields of Normandy gave way to hills, forests, rivers, and narrow roads along Germany's western frontier. Tanks were constrained. Infantry advanced slowly, often under fire. At the highest levels of command, disagreements emerged. One approach favored concentrating resources on a northern thrust through Belgium and the Netherlands, bypassing much of the Westwall and crossing the Rhine early. Another favored sustained pressure along the central and southern sectors. Ultimately, priority was given to the northern approach under Bernard Montgomery, aimed at opening Antwerp and shortening supply lines. This decision slowed other Allied advances, and time once again favored the defenders. As German units were redeployed, responsibility for the western defenses fell to Walter Model. Model was not a visionary architect of fortifications. He was a crisis manager. Wherever a front threatened to collapse, he was sent to stabilize it. His leadership style was harsh and uncompromising. He forced shattered formations into coherent defensive groups. Under his direction, the Westwall became a system designed not to defeat the enemy outright, but to wear him down. Among all the sectors of the Westwall, two would come to symbolize the Allied struggle: the city of Aachen, the first German city to face a direct Allied assault, and Hürtgen Forest, a dense woodland where terrain itself became a weapon. In these areas, bunkers did not need to be everywhere. Mines, trees, fog, and artillery bursts in the treetops were enough to halt and advance. Each step forward became a calculation of risk. American soldiers would later give the forest a name that reflected its reality: the Death Factory. By early September 1944, both sides stood before the Westwall with very different expectations. The Allies believed they were approaching the end of the war. The Germans understood they only needed to delay. The concrete of the Westwall did not promise victory for Berlin. It promised time. And in the months ahead, that time would be purchased with blood. There was no single day officially marked as the beginning of the battle for the Westwall. No dramatic landing, no beaches under fire, no moment that could be clearly isolated as the start. The transition happened quietly, and that made it more dangerous. It began the moment Allied troops ran into concrete. In early September 1944, forward elements of the U.S. Army reached the German-Luxembourg frontier. In some sectors, they approached the Westwall with little immediate resistance. A number of bunkers appeared empty. Some positions had been abandoned. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the defensive line was collapsing before it had even been fully manned. That impression was deceptive. The Westwall was not designed to fight everywhere at once. It functioned as an elastic defensive system. Weak points were left thin to lure attackers forward. Strong points were positioned to kill. As American units moved deeper, they entered zones of overlapping fire that had been hastily restored but were fully lethal. The first penetrations followed a pattern: fast, narrow, and unstable. In several places, American forces managed to push through the Westwall in September. On operational maps, these were successes. On the ground, they were liabilities. These penetrations were often only a few hundred meters wide. They lacked depth. Supply could not follow. The flanks remained exposed. German forces allowed these thrusts to pass, then sealed them off, cutting lines of communication and counterattacking in detail. American records later described these advances as pencil-thin penetrations. They did not create breakthroughs. They created isolated salients. At this stage, the Westwall was already fulfilling its purpose. It did not need to stop the Allies completely. It only needed to break their rhythm. At the same time, Allied logistical problems intensified. Fuel stocks were insufficient for all armies. Artillery ammunition had to be rationed. Truck columns were worn down by the long haul from Normandy. Antwerp, though captured, remained unusable because German forces still controlled the Scheldt estuary. A strategic decision followed. Priority would be given to the northern advance, through Belgium and the Netherlands, rather than maintaining full pressure along the entire Westwall. This decision altered the balance. American units facing the Westwall were forced to pause. And in war, pauses belonged to the defender. The breathing space proved decisive. German forces were transferred from Norway, Denmark, Italy, and even from the Eastern Front, despite the advancing Soviet armies. Hitler accepted the risk in the East to stabilize the West. Command of the most critical sectors was given to Walter Model. Model did not command strong, intact armies. He commanded fragments, and he turned those fragments into a defensive system capable of holding. Under his direction, improvised units, Volksgrenadier formations, SS elements, and survivors from Normandy were packed into the Westwall. The line became a human defense, not just a concrete one. Among all the objectives along the Westwall, Aachen carried a significance beyond its military value. Aachen was the first German city to face a direct Allied assault. For Berlin, it was a historical symbol. For Washington, it was a psychological test. Initially, Aachen was not considered a decisive objective, but the ferocity of German resistance forced a choice. Bypass the city or destroy it. The Americans chose destruction. Heavy artillery was brought forward. Tactical aircraft were committed. The city was systematically reduced. Each block became a separate defensive position. Tanks advanced intersection by intersection, using direct fire to collapse entire buildings that sheltered machine guns and snipers. Aachen did not fall quickly. It was ground down. The battle for Aachen exposed a harsh reality. The Americans possessed overwhelming firepower, but firepower alone did not guarantee momentum in urban combat. Artillery could demolish buildings, but infantry still had to clear them. Aircraft could bomb targets, but could not isolate every bunker or cellar. Tanks could advance, but were vulnerable to fire from above, below, and behind. American tactics evolved accordingly. Instead of preserving the city, they destroyed it deliberately. Resistance points were eliminated by collapsing the structures around them. Main roads were dominated by fire, while infantry filtered through side streets. Aachen was not captured. It was neutralized by annihilation. Fighting around Aachen made one thing clear. Artillery and air power were insufficient against the Westwall's bunkers. High explosive shells could not reliably penetrate reinforced concrete roofs. Bombs rarely struck small, hardened targets directly. Ultimately, the burden fell on infantry. Bunkers had to be attacked from the rear, with demolition charges, flamethrowers, and close-quarters assaults. This was the form of warfare for which American forces had the least experience. Each bunker became a separate battle. Each battle produced casualties. East of Aachen lay terrain that maps failed to capture accurately. Hürtgen Forest, a dense forest of pines, steep ravines, narrow muddy trails, limited visibility. Tanks struggled to move. Artillery observation was poor. Air support was restricted by weather and tree cover. Initially, the Hürtgen Forest was assigned a secondary role, flank protection. But once American units entered, withdrawal became impossible without exposing the main advance. What began as a supporting mission turned into a primary battlefield. The Germans exploited the terrain with precision. Mines were laid extensively. Artillery was calibrated to burst in the treetops, turning wood splinters into lethal shrapnel. Engagements occurred at close range, often without warning. In the forest, there were no rapid advances. Progress was measured in tens of meters. One unit replaced another, only to be withdrawn weeks later after heavy losses. Many soldiers suffered no physical wounds yet collapsed psychologically. Combat fatigue became widespread. Companies rarely operated at full strength. Replacements arrived with no time to integrate. Here, the Westwall required no concrete. The forest itself was the wall. By early October 1944, a fundamental truth had emerged. The Allies were no longer advancing at speed. The Westwall had succeeded. Instead of a campaign aimed at ending the war in 1944, the Western Front entered a phase of attritional warfare. Each city, each forest, each bunker became a debt to be paid in blood. The turning point did not lie in a German victory. It lay in the loss of Allied momentum. From this moment on, the Westwall ceased to be underestimated. It became the central strategic problem of the Western Front. Aachen was still fighting. The Hürtgen Forest was only beginning its work. The Westwall remained intact. The war in the West was no longer a race toward the Rhine. It had become a calculation. How much would it cost to move one more mile? If Part 2 marked the moment the Allies realized the Westwall could not be broken quickly, Part 3 was when they learned something far worse. Even when ground was taken, the cost could hollow out an entire campaign. By late September 1944, Aachen was encircled. Not by medieval siege lines, but by artillery, aircraft armor, and infantry operating in a shattered urban grid. For the U.S. Army, Aachen presented a form of warfare few units had experienced at this scale. For the German defenders, Aachen was German soil. Unlike towns in France that had often been abandoned or lightly held, Aachen was defended in depth. Regular army units, Volksgrenadier formations, SS detachments, and ad hoc battle groups were ordered to hold every meter, regardless of losses. Hitler's directive was unambiguous: no retreat, no surrender. The city became a network of strong points, every building a firing position, every basement a shelter, every intersection a killing zone. American forces brought overwhelming firepower to bear. Artillery flattened blocks of buildings. Tactical aircraft struck repeatedly. Tanks fired at point-blank range into masonry. Yet progress remained slow. Artillery could destroy structures, but infantry still had to occupy them. Airstrikes disrupted defenders, but could not eliminate every cellar and bunker. Tanks advanced cautiously, vulnerable to fire from upper floors, rubble piles, and rear alleys. Urban combat stripped away the advantages of speed and maneuver. The battlefield compressed distances. Visibility collapsed. Engagements became intimate and lethal. American tactics adapted. Preservation gave way to eradication. Buildings suspected of resistance were collapsed deliberately. Main streets were sealed by fire while infantry advanced through side streets and rubble. Aachen was not taken intact. It was systematically erased. When Aachen finally fell at the end of October, the defenders were exhausted, isolated, and cut off. Thousands were taken prisoner. Many more were dead. But the American cost was heavy. What mattered was not the exact numbers, but the rate at which units were consumed. Infantry companies lost men faster than replacements could absorb the environment. Platoons entered the city at full strength and emerged with half their numbers gone. Victory in Aachen did not restore momentum. It drained it. Beyond the city lay terrain even less forgiving. If Aachen was an urban hell, Hürtgen Forest was a natural one. The forest was dense, cold, wet, and dark. Pine trees blocked light and sound. Ravines cut movement into narrow corridors. Trails were muddy and mined. Maps offered little help. Here, the Westwall did not rely on massive concrete bunkers. It relied on the forest itself. Mines were buried beneath soaked leaves. Machine gun positions were camouflaged into the terrain. Artillery was pre-registered to burst in the treetops. Shells detonated above the ground, showering splinters downward. Earth offered no protection. Men were wounded without ever seeing the enemy. The Hürtgen Forest had initially been assigned a supporting role. flank protection for the advance toward the Rhine. But once units entered, disengagement became dangerous. Withdrawal would expose adjacent formations. The commitment became self-sustaining. American commanders underestimated several factors: the density of minefields, the effectiveness of dispersed German defenses, the psychological impact of continuous forest fighting. Instead of bypassing the terrain, they pressed into it. That decision condemned multiple divisions to prolonged attrition. In the forest, war ceased to resemble arrows on a map. It became a series of fragmented encounters. A fire team crawling through a ravine, a platoon losing direction in fog, a squad ambushed at 30 meters by unseen defenders. Radio communication often failed. Units lost contact with one another. Artillery support was difficult to coordinate. Air support was unreliable. German defenders held the advantage. They were static. They knew the ground. They waited. American soldiers gave the Hürtgen Forest its grim nickname for a reason. Divisions rotated in and out, each suffering heavy losses. One formation would enter the forest, fight for weeks, then be withdrawn and shattered, only to be replaced by another. The pattern repeated. Some companies lost more than half their strength in days. Others never reached authorized manpower again. Combat fatigue spread rapidly. Men stopped reacting to shell fire. Emotional withdrawal became common. Soldiers continued forward because no alternative existed. The forest consumed men without spectacle. As autumn turned toward winter, conditions worsened. Rain-soaked uniforms, mud-swallowed boots. Cold crept into bones. Dry shelter was rare. Wet clothing did not dry. Non-combat casualties mounted. Trench foot, exhaustion, infection. These losses rarely appeared in headlines, but they drained combat effectiveness as surely as enemy fire. German defenders, though poorly supplied, occupied fixed positions. They had bunkers, shelters, and predictable rotations. They endured by holding still. The attackers did not. Far from the forest, senior Allied commanders faced mounting pressure. The advance could not stop. Stalemate could not be acknowledged. Withdrawal without gains was unacceptable. Every delay in the west allowed the Red Army to advance farther from the east. Every failure along the Westwall carried strategic implications. As a result, assaults continued. Despite unchanged terrain, despite growing losses, despite diminishing returns, the machine kept moving. By late November 1944, the Westwall was no longer perceived as a line of fortifications. It had become a sequence of attritional engagements, a system that consumed infantry strength, a psychological environment as destructive as any weapon. The Allies were still advancing, but they advanced slowly, heavily, and without momentum. This was no longer a war of breakthroughs. It was a war of endurance. Amid the grinding attrition, a realization began to form. The problem was not firepower. It was not numbers. It was approach. The Westwall could not be defeated by frontal assault alone. German forces had to be drawn out of their fortifications. They had to be engaged in open maneuver where Allied advantages could matter. The idea remained theoretical. For now. While American infantry fought tree by tree and building by building, the German High Command prepared a move of its own, one that would abruptly shift the focus of the war. Aachen had fallen. The Hürtgen Forest had not. The Westwall still stood. The Allies had entered the inner hell of the defensive system. They had not been defeated, but they had lost the most valuable asset of an attacking army: momentum. The Westwall did not collapse in a single moment. It did not break under one decisive blow. It lost its meaning gradually, as the war itself found another way forward. By late November 1944, Allied forces had been pressing against the Westwall for nearly 3 months. Casualties mounted. Momentum faded. Worn divisions were rotated out, only to be sent back into the line once they had barely recovered. The Germans had achieved what they needed most: time. And they spent that time on one final gamble. On December 16, 1944, under heavy snow and low cloud, German forces launched their last major offensive on the Western Front. The objective was not the Westwall. The objective was to rupture the Allied front, seize fuel depots, split Allied armies, and force a negotiated peace. History would remember it as the Battle of the Bulge. For the West Wall, the Ardennes offensive had two immediate effects. First, it pulled Allied attention and resources away from direct assaults on the fortifications. Second, it extended the period during which the West Wall could continue to serve its purpose. For weeks, the center of gravity shifted away from concrete and bunkers to frozen forests, narrow roads, and desperate defensive stands. Initially, the German attack achieved surprise. Several American units were driven back. Supply lines were temporarily disrupted. For a brief moment, the Western Front bent under the pressure, but the offensive lacked what Germany no longer possessed. Fuel ran out. Air superiority returned to the Allies as the weather cleared. Reserves did not exist. By early January 1945, the German advance stalled and then collapsed. The losses were catastrophic and irreversible. When the Ardennes fighting ended, Germany had exhausted its last strategic initiative. And the West Wall, though still standing in places, was now behind the shifting front. After Ardennes, Allied commanders reached a clear conclusion. The West Wall could not be defeated by prolonged frontal assault. It had to be rendered irrelevant. Rather than continue to batter fortified positions head-on, the Allies aimed to force German units out of their bunkers and into mobile battles, where Allied artillery, armor, and air power could be decisive. The solution was not to destroy the wall everywhere, but to go around it, through it, and behind it. In the north, British and Canadian forces launched sustained operations against layered German defenses connected to the West Wall system. The terrain was muddy and mined. Progress was slow, but German formations were now short of manpower, ammunition, and cohesion. Defensive lines were breached not by dramatic breakthroughs, but by relentless pressure. Strong points were isolated. Counterattacks weakened. Gaps widened. The West Wall began to lose its continuity. In the central and southern sectors, George S. Patton brought the U.S. Third Army back into the offensive. Patton never regarded the West Wall as invulnerable. To him, it was a matter of tempo. As weather improved and supply flows stabilized, Third Army artillery opened massive bombardments. Assault units crossed rivers under fire and struck the rear faces of bunkers. This exposed the fundamental weakness of the West Wall. The fortifications were designed to fight westward. Attacked from the east, many positions were tactically blind. By early 1945, American units advancing toward the West Wall often prepared for fierce resistance and encountered none. Bunkers stood silent. Steel doors were closed but unmanned. Some German troops surrendered immediately. Others withdrew at night, abandoning positions they no longer had orders or strength as to hold. In some cases, defenders discarded uniforms, blended into civilian columns, and fled eastward. The West Wall remained, its garrison did not. On March 7, 1945, advance elements of a U.S. armored division reached the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen. The bridge was still standing. German engineers had placed demolition charges, but the explosion failed to destroy the structure completely. Within hours, American infantry crossed the Rhine and established the first Allied bridgehead on the eastern bank. The significance of this moment outweighed every bunker of the West Wall. It demonstrated that the defensive system had been strategically bypassed, even while sections of it remained intact. 10 days later, the bridge collapsed. By then, it no longer mattered. As Allied armies poured across the Rhine, the West Wall was left in the rear. It was not annihilated, it was overtaken by events. Its primary mission, keeping Allied forces out of Germany, had failed. Its secondary mission, buying time, had succeeded. Nearly 3 months had been gained, at immense cost. The time purchased by the West Wall did not save Germany, but it altered the endgame. While Allied forces were slowed in the west, Soviet armies advanced relentlessly from the east. Berlin fell to the Red Army. The political map of post-war Europe shifted. The West Wall did not decide who won the war. It helped decide who arrived first. In purely military terms, the West Wall failed. It did not stop the Allies. It did not protect German territory indefinitely. But in the logic of attritional warfare, it functioned as intended. It forced the enemy to fight in unfavorable conditions. It converted speed into logistical burden. It delayed a mechanized army without requiring decisive victory. The West Wall was never meant to be perfect. It was meant to delay. For the soldiers on both sides, the West Wall was not a strategic concept. It was A cold, damp bunker. A forest that never ended. A city reduced to rubble, block by block. Many survivors carried the experience with them long after the war ended. Many others never left the line at all. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Westwall was barely mentioned. Attention shifted to Berlin, to the ruins of the Third Reich, to the shape of a new world. Yet the concrete remains still trace the western border of Germany. They remind us that in modern war, victory is not only achieved through breakthroughs, but through the ability to force the enemy to pay for every day gained.